Amongst the tools available in CAQDAS packages for capturing meaning in qualitative data are coding and linking tools. But what's the difference, and how do we know when each is most appropriate? Let's take a look. Okay, so when we code, we create a label that represents the idea, concept, theme, category, topic that we see in the material. So as an example, I'm going to create a code label here called peer pressure. And this was a concept that I was interested in during my master's and PhD research. And we may also be working with a number of data sources, maybe transcripts of interviews, field notes, reports, visual materials, whatever. So I'll just create an example. So this might be a transcript of an interview. Here's some sentences and paragraphs. You'll probably be working with multiple sources, maybe multiple sources of different types. But just for today's example, let's just have two examples here. Maybe these are interview transcripts. In fact, this could be an interview transcript with somebody who is called Frank, and maybe this is Carol, or it could be focus groups, whatever. Okay, here they are then. Okay, so without going into the methodological aspects of how we generate codes or how we decide what to code or how much to code, if you want to go into those topics, then a great starting place is the textbook by Johnny Saldana, the Coding Manual for Qualitative Researchers. I'll drop the link to that below the video later. But the practical process is a tagging activity, okay? So what we do is we identify a segment of data and we attach the code that we've labeled to it. And we do that several times. So let's imagine that this bit here is an instance of peer pressure. So we select it, just like you would select text in a word file or anything else, and we attach that to our code. Maybe in Carol, there's a much longer segment where she's talking about peer pressure. Okay, so that's a tagging exercise. So what we're essentially saying by tagging in that way is this segment and this segment and this segment are all instances of whatever that code represents. And so there are several benefits of doing that in a CAQDAS package in comparison to using manual methods such as highlighter pens or using general purpose software actually that isn't designed for qualitative analysis. And one of those benefits is that later on, we can open up this code, okay, and we can look inside it. And when we look inside that code, then what we get to see are all of those little bits of data, okay? So the two short bits from the first transcript by Frank and the second one. Right, and then the longer one coming from the other document. Okay, and so we're looking inside the code and we're able to see just those instances of our code label. Incidentally, that's not a copy-paste process. We're not losing connection. This is just a window. The code, the peer pressure code, is just a window through which we are able to see those extracts. But we're always able to quickly and easily jump back to the source material. Okay, so jump to the source material because everything is interconnected. Okay, so that's all really useful. Okay, it's always useful to be able to see all of those segments about peer pressure together from inside the code as instances, as I said, of whatever it represents, peer pressure in this example. But although all of these segments may be instances of that concept, they may not all be equivalent, right? There may be different nuances that we see, and they maybe reveal themselves when we're looking inside that code later on. Some of those nuances we may be able to handle by recoding for the nuance. So let's just imagine that we realize that there's a difference between subtle peer pressure. And then we also see imagined peer pressure. And we also see explicit peer pressure. So all of those instances that we coded previously to peer pressure, they're all about peer pressure, but there's some different nuances. And absolutely, we can recode those if we want to. Okay, so we could say that this one, in a similar way, is subtle, this one is explicit, etc. And that can be really useful. But what happens if we see an association in the data about these aspects of peer pressure here, okay, which isn't captured as a subcategory in that way? So subtle, imagined, and explicit can be thought of as subcategories of peer pressure. But let's imagine that this instance here, where we see explicit peer pressure, and this one as well, which is also explicit peer pressure. Let's say that here, Frank says something about peer pressure being explicit in the sense that some of their friends verbally encourage or pressure friends to do certain things, maybe to engage in certain behaviors or whatever it might be, okay? And so here it's useful to be able to say that explicit peer pressure makes them feel uncomfortable. And I can code that to both the explicit peer pressure code, and maybe also I'll create another code called uncomfortable. Uncomfortable. That's not how you spell uncomfortable, but never mind. Okay, because the same or overlapping segments of text can, of course, be coded to multiple codes. So I'm capturing the fact that this is peer pressure, and maybe I've recoded that as explicit peer pressure. It might even be coded at both the top level peer pressure and the explicit peer pressure, and now also uncomfortable. So that's great. And it's possibly highly helpful to code the same or overlapping segments at more than one code in CAQDAS packages. But later on, Frank may say again here that peer pressure around this behavior is explicit, but this time is saying that it's easy to ignore the peer pressure. Okay, so there's some kind of contradiction between what Frank is saying here about explicit peer pressure and what Frank is saying here about explicit peer pressure. So essentially, Frank is contradicting the earlier statement. Now, I could create another code called contradiction and code both of those segments to contradiction, but that's not going to connect them to one another in a very powerful way, because inside the explicit peer pressure code are other segments that have got nothing to do with uncomfortableness or being able to ignore the pressure or the contradiction that's evident between those two statements. Okay, so this is one situation when linking can come into its own to be really useful. Because in several CAQDAS packages, it's possible to link these two statements together. Okay, let me choose a different color. So I can link these two statements to one another, okay, either in a one directional way, so from one to the other, or I can do it with arrows on both directions if I want to. And that technically works like a hyperlink, okay? And that means that I can navigate via that link, so that's a link, okay? I can navigate from one segment to the other segment via the connection that I've made in that linking action, okay, without reference to any codes that may also be present. Now, most CAQDAS packages that enable this kind of linking, and they don't all do so, but most of them that do, allow pairs of links to be created, similar to what I've illustrated here, okay? And that can be really useful, okay? But there's one program, ATLAS.ti, that allows multiple segments to be linked. So not only can I go from this one to that one, but I can also go to that one, And I could also go maybe to another segment up here that hasn't been coded. So this is happening, this linking separately in isolation from any coding that you may have been doing. Not only that, in ATLAS.ti, these links can be labeled. So this can be labeled as a contradiction. So we can say this contradicts that, or we could label it in any way that we wanted to. For example, we could say associated with. We could say leads to. We can have any type of relationships, discusses, cites. That's useful when you're doing a literature review. Whatever you need to capture in that relationship, that can be labeled. So hopefully you can see the difference between what codes can do for us analytically in terms of capturing meaning and what linking can do. It's not that one's better than the other. It's that they can be used for different purposes, or in other words, we can harness these tools for different analytic needs. And that's really why it's crucial to forefront your analytic needs before choosing and using software tools, to think critically and creatively about the role of tools in enacting our methods. And that's what the 5-level QDA method is all about. And you can find out more about that from my website. And if you're interested in hyperlinking tools in ATLAS.ti specifically, then you can read about those in the textbooks that I've written, and also in an interview that I did with the developers a few years ago, as well as in the software manual.